In today's video, I'll be painting the Plague Marine kill team from the new kill team starter set to a standard that will make your body on the other end of the table go, whoa, those look sick, and I will do it in 2 hours per model. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Fun Miniatures. I will walk you through step by step how I first base coated everything, highlighted all the most important elements like the green armor, the bronze trim and all the steel bits, and then used all the tricks and shortcuts I know to paint all the details and effects but still finish in a reasonable 2 hours per model. Just a quick disclaimer, I only painted 6 out of the 7 models in this video because I have had this set since Games Workshop sold them as Space Marine Heroes more than a year ago, and I already painted one of them back then as a proof of concept for a more vibrant and saturated color scheme for my Death Guard. So in this project I used the standard bearer as my guide both in terms of quality and color scheme. Back then it took me more than 10 hours to paint him to that standard. Let's see how close we can get to that in only 2 hours per model. I think it will be pretty close. I started by using a very dark reddish brown base coat to start from, which will help me paint more vibrant colors and also serves as the first layer for some of the elements, speeding things up a bit. I achieved this by priming the models black and then spraying them from above with some translucent red color, in this case blood red from Vallejo. If you have a can of very dark red or brown primer, you can simply prime the models with that or paint a mix of black and red on the entire model with a big brush. But a simple black primer will be fine as well and you won't lose too much. I started painting by base coating the biggest elements, starting with the green since that one will be the most defining color of the kill team. To make things faster, I took one color and painted every model with that in an assembly line process. I found this more efficient than painting one model with all the colors and then moving on to the next. Back when I painted the standard bearer, I used the artist range of scale 75 because I thought I could achieve a more colorful end result with it. But this time I wanted to see if I can use something more widely available, like the combination of AK Interactive and Citadel paints, and not lose out on the colors. And I think I actually managed to make these guys even more saturated than the original. I painted the first green with a large brush and quite loosely. I tried not to hit the elements close to the green, but I wasn't trying too hard. I covered almost all of the reddish undercoat except in the darkest shadows, and I used 2 and in some cases 3 coats to get full coverage, concentrating the last ones mostly on the parts of the armor that would be hit by the light. The goal was to have the red undercoat be slightly visible in the shadows, but to have full opacity with the green in the light areas. This step took only a bit more than half an hour to complete for all the models, so I was up to a good start. The second big element was the bronze trim. This was done with whole red as the first color and I used the same big brush for it. I know that it might seem like a good idea to use a tiny brush to paint the trim, but it will actually make your life much more difficult and it will be a miserable experience. The trick is to use only slightly diluted paint and a big brush with a good tip. Then you brace your wrists and fingers in a way that only your fingers holding the brush can move. Once that's done, it's only a matter of a little experience and a lot of confidence. It's like walking a tightrope. As soon as you think about messing up, you will. So just listen to some music and don't look down. It took me around 30 minutes to paint the trim on all 6 models, covering basically everything and leaving some of the original dark red only in the deepest shadows. Before moving on to the final big base coat color, I decided to paint some of the few red elements. Don't ask me why, I just felt like it. I used corn red for this and simply covered everything in 2 coats of it. The third big base coat I did with dark sea blue, and I used this for everything that was meant to be steel later on. But not only that, I also painted some of the skin colors with this, so basically some of the Nurglings and the bodies of the flies. When you want to paint fast, instead of painting a gazillion different base coats, you can use the same base color for multiple elements to keep things simpler and speed up your base coating stage. Later you can differentiate these elements by changing their highlight colors. This also has the side effect of making your model more cohesive and preventing the clown effect, where you end up with a ton of different colors that don't go well with each other on the model. The final base coat was done with Barak Nur Burgundy for all the things I wanted to be purple, like half of the little gods, some of the weird fungus growing everywhere, as well as the cables all over the models. I painted the Nurglings half dark sea blue and half this color because some of the models have 2 of them and I didn't want them to look the same. This way I can also have a greenish blue Nurgling next to a purple element and a purple Nurgling next to a greenish element to make them stand out more. Alright, with that I had most of the colors blocked in on the models and it took me a little over 1.5 hours to do it. Now it was time to highlight everything. Once again I started with the green armor first and I painted on the same color on all of the 6 models before moving on to the brighter one. I chose medium olive green for my first highlight color for the green because it has a little yellow in it and it will serve as a nice middle ground between the original dark green and the very yellowish final highlight I was planning. I'm not a huge fan of the official Plague Marine color scheme Games Workshop uses. For me, Nurgle has always been about vibrant, riotous colors teeming with life, but also with disease. If you have seen the movie Annihilation, you will know what I mean. I covered 70–80% of the previous green with this, creating rough volumetric highlights and edge highlights where I thought the light coming from above would hit the models. This sounds complicated, but in most cases this just means painting the top of an object and leaving the bottom in shadow with a transition in between. Normally I would try to make these highlights as precise as possible with small scratches and dots on the boundary and use glazes to smooth out the transition between the colors. But this time I was trying to do this fast, so I didn't use any glazes and I concentrated on speed rather than precision. I switched to a slightly smaller brush than the one I used for the base coating, but still a bigger one than what I would usually use. This allowed me to paint longer before having to refill the brush, but made my highlights thicker and less precise than usual. But that is fine, since we just want to impress our friend on the other side of the table and not a judge on a competition holding a magnifying glass. A highlight might look rough up close, but when you see it from an arm's length away, it will look okay as long as it's more or less in the right spot. When I was done painting this on all 6 models, I switched to a green with even more yellow in it. Frog green is basically half green and half yellow, so it's perfect for making this green nice and vibrant. I repeated the previous step with this color, but now painting only inside the highlights I had previously created with the olive green and making sure that I left some of that darker color still visible. I was still using the same brush as before and used quick scratchy brush strokes, making sure to keep the transition line between this new color and the previous one scratchy and uneven. I didn't have time to glaze over them, and the unevenness will help disguise the transition from a distance. For the final highlight I switched to a smaller brush for more control and used Pistachio, which is basically a yellow with some green in it, so it will be perfect for a super vibrant and contrasty final highlight. I painted this on a very small area inside the previous highlights and only used it on parts of the edges completely facing up. I was almost done with the green armor, but before moving on to the bronze trim, I first diluted some Mournfang brown quite heavily and started painting it in the crevices of the green. I let it flow around the elements inside the green panels, around the trim itself, and also inside the pits and hollows of the armor. On some of the bigger panels I also use it as a very rough glaze, dragging it towards the shadows. This will make the armor look dirty and rusty, cover some of the roughness of the highlighting, and also darken the separation between the green elements and everything else, essentially functioning as a panel lining. All of the highlighting and the final glazing step took me a combined 3 hours of painting time. This is a pretty big chunk of the overall 12 for the 6 models, but this was the green armor, arguably the most important part of the model, so ultimately it was worth it. So let's move on to the bronze trim. And I know what you are thinking, this is non-metallic bronze, no way I can paint a decent non-metallic metal in such a short time, and you are right. So instead I will go for a very simplified version of NMM that will look very striking from a distance, but won't look butter smooth and perfect when looking at it up close. The trick is to use the right colors, placing them more or less in the right place and having large jumps in brightness between them, creating a lot of contrast. My first color was medium rust, and I painted roughly 70% of the surface of the trim with this, concentrating on painting all the edges, and when I had space also creating some larger scratchy highlights in between them. I made sure to hit all the rivets as well. Next I jumped up in brightness quite a bit and chose a color with a lot of white in it, Pastel Peach from AK Interactive. I repeated the previous step, but this time using a smaller brush and trying to make my edge highlights and scratchy highlights somewhat crisper. I painted only some of the edges, and even those only partially, and drastically reduced the area I covered with the highlights in general, leaving quite a bit of the previous color visible. Finally, I used ice yellow and a little pure white in strategic places, only painting some of the most prominent edges and adding a couple of dots where I thought the light would hit the armor the most. Before moving on to the steel, I thinned down some dark sea blue and dropped it around the rivets and some of the cracks in the bronze trim. This darkened those parts down further, creating more contrast, and also served as a beginning of a verdigris effect. Finally, I took a brighter blue-green color and painted it over the same area, but made sure that it doesn't cover the dark sea blue fully. If you don't have this one, you can also use something like Temple Guard Blue from Citadel. And that is our rough bronze metals done in a little over 2 hours. Let's move on to the steel bits next. The metal is the same as for the bronze, but instead of using different colors, I took the original dark sea blue base coat color and started adding white to it to create my highlights. At first only about 20% white into 80% dark sea blue, and later increasing the amount of white quite a bit. Otherwise everything was the same as with the bronze. I edge highlighted everything and placed sketchy highlights in areas that would be hit by the light whenever I had the space for them. Before I reached the highest highlights, I switched to ivory. This color has a little yellow in it in addition to being close to white, so it creates a nice contrast with the previous highlights. I used this very sparingly, only on the most prominent edges, and created very small highlights inside the previous ones, just like I did with the ice yellow on the bronze. Finally, I added a couple of dots and tiny highlights with pure whites to create even more contrast and to represent some glints on the metal. Just like with the bronze, I decided to spice the steel up a little bit as well, but instead of verdigris, I did some rust effect instead. I thinned down Mournfang brown to a glaze again and dropped it into the crevices and cracks of the metal. I also let it flow around the rivets and all around the bends and turns of the metal bits. And in some places where I had larger surfaces to deal with, I glazed it into the shadows as well. This whole process took me another 2 hours for the 6 models, which meant that I had spent around 7.5 hours on the models up until this point. But it also meant that I was done with 3 of the most important parts, so now it was time to paint some of the smaller but still important colors. Since I already had the dark sea blue on the wet palette, I started by painting the greenish skin tones first. Instead of a white, I mixed in some sunny skin tone into the dark sea blue, and I started highlighting the Nurglings and the flies with that. This was skin and not armor, so this time I diluted the paint a little more and painted more or less homogeneous highlights instead of scratchy ones. Fortunately for us, these things are quite small, so I didn't have to worry about smoothness too much. It was enough if the highlights were placed correctly. That is to say, on the surfaces facing the light, leaving the previous colors visible in the shadows. I kept adding more and more sunny skin tone into the mix until I reached the highest highlights with almost pure sunny skin tone. When I was done, I took some Barrack Nur Burgundy and I did the exact same process with it. The difference was that when I was done, the end result was a little too desaturated. I suppose the base color contained a little too much white already and didn't work as well as the dark sea blue. No worries, I simply took some Sigwald Burgundy contrast and diluted it slightly with water on the wet palette. Then I painted it all over the purple skin and cables, but I wiped it away from most of the highest highlights. This brought back the saturation quite nicely and created a disgusting sickly purplish skin color. These two colors took around 1.5 hours combined. Now it was time to do some of the fun Nurgle stuff, like the worms, the pustules and the slime dripping out from some of the armor and the weapons. Normally I would find different colors for these things, but that would mean finding different highlight colors and a lot of additional time needed. Instead, I decided to paint all of these with the same orangish yellow colors. This will help tie the kill team together in terms of colors even more, and because most of the models only had one of these elements on them, so either worms or pustules, it wouldn't really be confusing for the viewer. First I painted everything with medium orange to provide a nice saturated shadow color for my yellows. Painting yellow directly over a dark base coat is very difficult. It will take a lot of coats and the end result will look quite boring. So instead the way to go is to start from something close to red, then go through orange to yellow and leave the oranges in the shadow. This way you only need to use 2 coats of each and the end result will also look much nicer. So using this method I followed up the orange with volcanic yellow and I did the final highlights with deep yellow. At this point I had all the disgusting Nurgle bits finished, so I added a gloss varnish over all of these elements, basically the purple and the greenish skin and all the yellows. This will make them look wet and glossy and it will also make them even more saturated. Now I only had a couple of other colors left. I did a basic bone recipe on all the horns, skulls and teeth. I used the original reddish brown undercoat as a base coat and highlighted it up with Zendri dust and Ushabti bone, making everything lighter towards the tip. And to be efficient, I also used the same colors to highlight a couple of leather bits these guys have, like belts and weapon shafts. When I was done with the highlights, I used skeleton horde contrast on all of the bones, dragging it from the lighter towards the shadow areas and wiping it away from the highest highlights. On the leather, I used undiluted snakebite leather contrast to differentiate the two materials. The red bits are not very prominent on these guys, mostly just some loincloths, except the big red cape on the team leader. On the loincloths I simply used a couple of edge highlights with Mephiston red. On the cape I painted the middle of the cape with this color to make it brighter and then diluted some dark sea blue to a glaze and painted it on the bottom of the cape to make it more interesting and sinister looking. Finally, while I had the Mephiston red handy, I also painted some of the eyes on the Nurglings and the flies. I painted the eye sockets with black and then dotted in the pupil with pure white, finally covering the white with a dot of Mephiston red. With that done, I turned my attention to the bases. I used some mud brown to overbrush the sculpted texture of the base. This texture is slightly raised, so it's easy to cover these details without hitting the recesses by applying only a little pressure with the side of the brush. I did the same thing with medium sand, but with even less pressure, covering even less area. Finally, I added some AK puddle effect to make everything look like these guys are trudging through a disgusting swamp. If you don't have this product, you can also just add a thick layer of gloss varnish. Now I only had a couple of small details to do. A couple of models had weapons that I wanted to leave black, so I highlighted their edges and added a couple of scratches to make them look used. I painted all the edges with reddish grey and then used a brighter grimy grey for only the edges facing up. I painted some white lines in the recesses of the plasma gun and then covered the coils with ball red contrast. It wasn't punchy enough, so I reinforced it with the same orange I used for the yellow Nurgle bits earlier. The very last thing to do was the magical fire effect on 2 of the models. I covered the flames with grimy grey first and then the parts facing up with pure white. Then the whole thing got 2 coats of athermatic blue contrast. All of these small elements combined took me a little over 3 hours to complete, so adding up everything, around 12 hours for the 6 models, 2 hours each, and the end result looks like this. Considering that I painted the 6 Marines in roughly the same amount of time as the one standard bearer, I think he fits in nicely with the group. They are not exactly display case quality, but I think they are good enough to turn a couple of heads when you plop them down on the table in your local gaming shop. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. And if you want to have a written version of this guide with all the colors, a ton of pictures and all the explanations, then head over to my Patreon. Thanks a lot for watching and for your support. See you in the next one.